You're going to be shocked to learn about the punishments in ancient Egypt that were downright insane. From nose amputations to feeding criminals to crocodiles, the ancient Egyptians had some of the craziest and most brutal punishments in history. Join us as we explore the bizarre world of ancient Egyptian justice. Number 12. Punishment for murder. Now, you might be thinking, hey, Egypt was all about those pyramids and mummies, what's this about crazy punishments? But hold on to your chariot, because you're about to discover a whole new side for this ancient civilization. First things first, the Egyptians had a deep respect for life and the sanctity of it. So when it came to punishment for taking a life, they didn't mess around. Murder was divided into intentional and unintentional, with intentional murder being the most serious offense, and boy did they make an example out of those who committed intentional murder. For instance, if a father killed his own son or daughter, his body would be tied to the corpse of his victim for 3 days until decomposition. If a son or daughter killed one of their parents, they were burned alive. That's right, you heard me, burned alive. Talk about a severe psychological sanction. But it wasn't just murder that had insane punishments. Grave robbers beware, because if you were caught stealing from tombs, you might end up being prey for crocodiles or impaled. Yikes. And if you thought covering up a murder was a good idea, think again. Anyone who withheld information or helped cover up a murder was subject to stand trial and potentially face the same punishment as the murderer. There's some serious guilt by association. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Involuntary manslaughter didn't have a specific penalty, but the perpetrator was expected to make offerings, seek forgiveness from the victim's family, and make appropriate compensation. It's almost like a precursor to our modern-day idea of restorative justice. However, there was one crime that was especially heinous in the eyes of the Egyptians: killing an animal with symbolic religious significance. If you did this intentionally, you were looking at the ultimate punishment: execution. Number 11. Punishment for adultery. Get ready to dive into the juicy details of adultery in ancient Egypt. Believe it or not, this taboo topic was actually considered a religious crime in those times, and the punishment was severe. We're talking death penalty severe. According to the teachings of Ptah Hut, men were warned not to be fascinated by women, as it could lead to their downfall. He even goes so far as to say that 1,000 men have perished due to their relationships with women. Yikes, talk about a warning. When it came to adultery with a married woman, the Egyptians considered it a crime deserving of death. Why, you ask? Because they believed it was easier to commit any other sin after committing adultery. So to prevent the spread of immorality in society, they went straight for the ultimate punishment. Now, if the crime was committed by a married woman, her husband had the legal right to punish or forgive her, or leave it up to the court to decide if he accused her with no proof. It's almost like a medieval version of a marital dispute. But here's where things get even more interesting. The punishment for the man involved in adultery was much lighter than the punishment for the woman. Why again? Because the Egyptians believed that the offense primarily fell on the woman's shoulders. So while the women were sentenced to death, men were only subjected to 1,000 blows. Ouch. Number 10. Theft and punishment. Let's talk about theft and punishment in ancient Egypt. Get ready for some jaw-dropping revelations, folks. Now, if you were caught stealing someone's personal property back in the day, you could expect to pay a hefty fine of up to 2 or 3 times the value of the stolen goods. But if you were foolish enough to steal public property, well, you better be prepared to cough up a whopping 180 times the amount of what you took. Ouch, that's gonna hurt your wallet. But the punishment didn't stop there, my friends. Once you were caught, you were ordered to return the stolen goods and confess to your crime. And this is where things get really intense. You were subjected to a brutal beating of 100 strokes by hand, had to swear an oath, or even thrown into the river for crocodiles to have their way with you. Talk about some seriously scary stuff. And if you thought that was bad enough, get this: your entire sentence was carried out in full public display for everyone to see. So if you're hoping to keep your theory on the down low, think again, because your shame would be on full display for everyone. In some cases, stealing could even lead to exile or banishment from one's community. This punishment was reserved for repeat offenders or those who had committed particularly egregious thefts. It's fascinating to see how ancient civilizations dealt with crime and punishment, even if their methods were a little extreme by our standards. Number 9. Punishment for bribery. So why was bribery such a big deal? Well, it turns out this shady practice had a negative impact on the entire administrative process, creating chaos and disorder within the government. In fact, some corrupt government clerks would go so far as stealing files from judicial archives to cover up their crimes. Now, bribery wasn't just a problem for government officials, it was a widespread issue that affected all levels of society. Wealthy individuals would use their money to bribe officials for special favors or to avoid punishment for their crimes. And if you didn't have enough money to bribe your way out of trouble, you were out of luck. But the consequences of bribery didn't stop at just the individual level. It had a negative impact on society as a whole, as corrupt officials would abuse their power and neglect their duties, leading to a breakdown in the administrative process. The punishments for bribery were certainly no joke. If caught taking bribes, you could expect to be publicly humiliated and stripped of your rank and title, reduced to the lowest stature of a farmer. It was a clear message that bribery would not be tolerated in ancient Egypt. But despite these severe consequences, bribery continued to plague the society. Even notorious criminals like thieves and grave robbers were able to bribe their way out of punishment, causing outrage and frustration among the general population. It's crazy to think that even thousands of years ago people were still struggling with issues of corruption and bribery. But the punishment was certainly harsher back then, making it clear that such actions would not be tolerated. Number 8. Punishment for treason. In the grand scheme of things, there are few crimes that can be considered as vile and unforgivable as treason. Back in ancient Egypt, the penalty for such a crime was straightforward and absolute: death. It didn't matter if you were high or low born, close to the king or far away from him. If you conspired against the kingdom, you were going down. Take, for instance, the story of King Ramses III and his wife T. The king, as is the case with many monarchs, had to choose an heir to his throne, and this didn't sit well with T. She had other plans. She wanted her son Natawa to be the next ruler, so she plotted to assassinate her own husband, the king. Talk about family drama. But T's nefarious plans were soon uncovered, and she and her fellow conspirators were prosecuted and punished accordingly. And you don't want to know what the punishment was? Okay, fine, I'll tell you. It was the Big E, execution. And if you thought the punishment couldn't get any worse, think again. Not only were traitors executed, but they weren't even given a proper burial. That's right, no final resting place for those who dared to go against His Majesty. Their bodies were thrown into the river like yesterday's trash. So let this be a lesson to all you aspiring traitors out there. Think twice before you plot against the kingdom, or you might just end up sleeping with the fishes. Number 7. Punishment for stealing. In ancient Egypt, one of the most heinous crimes was the theft of public property, particularly if the stolen object had significant religious or cultural value. The Egyptians believed that stealing from public property was equivalent to stealing from the gods, and thus was a serious offense that warranted severe punishment. If someone was found guilty of stealing from public property, the penalty was often up to 180 times the value of the stolen materials. The accused would be ordered to return the stolen goods. After confessing to the crime, would often receive a public beating of 100 strokes by hand as punishment. In some cases, if the stolen item was particularly valuable, the accused could be thrown into the river to be devoured by crocodiles. The entire sentence would be carried out in front of everyone as a warning to others who might consider committing a similar crime. Thus, stealing public property wasn't the only crime that was severely punished in ancient Egypt. Grave robbing was also considered a great offense, especially if the tomb belonged to a royal figure such as a king, queen, or prince. The penalty for grave robbing was death, as it was considered a crime against the state. However, in some cases the punishment was reduced to the cutting off of hands or the beating of 100 blows if the mummy was left untouched. To protect against any aggression, special laws were created to safeguard the tombs of the pharaohs, and anyone caught violating them would face harsh consequences. The penalty from stealing from a temple, whether it was an artifact or an animal, was also severe, with a punishment of 100 blows and 100 times the usual fine. Even those who slowed in solving the problem, such as judges who failed to deliver swift justice, were not spared punishment. In one case, the judge of the city of Ra received 100 strikes, was removed from his position, and was placed as a cultivation agent. In ancient Egypt, justice was swift and severe, with no leniency for those who violated the law. The Egyptians believed that these harsh penalties were necessary to maintain order and to prevent anyone from committing similar crimes in the future. These punishments may seem extreme to us today, but they were an integral part of the Egyptian legal system and played a crucial role in maintaining their civilization for thousands of years. Number 6 is slave labor. In ancient Egypt, punishment for crimes was no laughing matter. Instead of locking up criminals, the Egyptians put them to work in the most grueling jobs imaginable. Imagine being sentenced to spend all day, every day, in a blistering desert heat, mining for granite in the quarries. That was the fate of many criminals who were enslaved and forced to work in the construction of the pyramids. Now, although many people assume that slaves built the pyramids, historians argued that skilled craftsmen actually did most of the work. However, criminals still played a major role in this monumental task. They were considered a permanent crew and had the excruciating job of cutting millions of stone blocks out of the rock cliffs which would be used to build the Great Pyramid of Giza. In fact, a whopping 2,300,000 blocks of stone were quarried just to build that one pyramid. This shows just how severe the consequences of being a criminal were in ancient Egypt. While the paid craftsmen who constructed the pyramids only worked on the project for 2 months out of the year, the prisoners had no days off. But it wasn't just the pyramids that the criminals had to work on. Forced labor was prevalent in ancient Egypt as it was more useful to use culprits than to imprison them. Rather than being locked up, they were put to work in the gold mines of the Eastern Desert or threatened with exile to Nubia, which is modern-day northern Sudan. Many criminals were even enslaved and used as farming laborers and domestic servants. But the most grueling job was undoubtedly the mining of granite in the quarries. This job required intense muscle power and strenuous effort, which could result in serious injuries or even death. So the next time you're feeling a little lazy, just be thankful that you're not a criminal in ancient Egypt. Number 5, corporal punishment. Corporal punishment was all the rage back in the day, and we're not talking a little slap on the wrist. No, we're talking full-blown beatings with a wooden stick. And not just a few whacks either, we're talking 10, 20, 50, 100, or even a whopping 200 times. Ouch. But wait, it gets worse. The punishment wasn't limited to just a good old-fashioned beating. Oh no, the Egyptians got creative with their discipline. They also dabbed in branding and mutilation, with offenders having their noses and ears sliced off as a consequence of their crimes. And if that wasn't enough, the culprits were often bound to a pillory or yoked up for public humiliation. I think that sounds bad, it gets even more gruesome. Tomb reliefs actually show people being beaten, and not just in official capacity. These were private beatings of subordinates, which probably happened way more often than they should have. If you thought these punishments were just a slap on the wrist, think again. Many skeletons from this time period show multiple bone fractures, which can only be interpreted as the result of severe and brutal beatings. In fact, a large percentage of the common population of Elephantine in the Old Kingdom and First Intermediate period suffered from this kind of torture. And that's not all. Branding and mutilation may not show up on skeletons, but we do have a sculptor's model of a man with his nose cut off. So it's safe to say that the ancient Egyptians didn't mess around when it came to justice. You definitely didn't want to end up on the wrong side of the law. Number 4, public humiliation and false witness. Back in ancient times, being accused of a crime was a surefire way to ruin your reputation, even if you were eventually found innocent. Suspects would have their names put on record, marking them as a person involved in a dispute or violation, which could lead to a lifetime of shame and embarrassment. And to ensure that witnesses didn't take this responsibility lightly, the punishment for giving false testimony was severe. It's almost as if the law had a deep understanding of the impact a tarnished reputation could have on one's life. False witnesses were subject to a range of cruel and unusual punishments, from amputation to drowning. It was clear the judicial system was willing to go to great lengths to ensure that only the truth was spoken in the courtroom. And given the gravity of the crimes that could be committed, it's no surprise that the punishment for the most serious offences was equally severe. For instance, those convicted of sexual assault faced the horrifying prospect of having their genitals removed. And as for murderers, they were either burned alive or fed to the crocodiles. It's a stark reminder of just how brutal and unforgiving the ancient justice system could be. In a nutshell, the punishment for lying or falsely accusing someone was not to be taken lightly. In a society where reputation was everything, the potential for a lifetime of disgrace was enough to make anyone think twice before taking the stand. And with punishments ranging from amputation to death, there was simply no room for dishonesty in the courtroom. Number 3. City of the Noseless. Did you know that in ancient Egypt there was a city known as Rhinocolura that was full of noseless criminals? According to legends from the ancient writers Strabo and Diodorus Siculus, this city was located in present-day El Arish, over 200 miles from Cairo. Apparently, if you committed a crime in ancient Egypt, you may have escaped death, but you wouldn't have escaped punishment. You had been sent to Rhinocolura, where your nose would have been amputated so that everyone could see that you were a criminal. So what was the punishment for? Well, ancient origins reports that the criminals sent to Rhinocolura were men who had been found guilty of stealing. It's a pretty harsh punishment if you ask me, but apparently the ancient Egyptians took their laws and justice system very seriously. Now you might be wondering what happened to the descendants of these criminals. According to the same source, a criminal's descendants would not have suffered the genetic repercussions of their parents' mutilation, so the distinct features of these people would have eventually phased out. So thankfully there are no noseless people walking around today as a result of this ancient Egyptian punishment. It's fascinating to learn about these ancient customs and punishments. It's a reminder that justice has always been a fundamental part of society, and that there have always been consequences for breaking the law. Number 2. Punishment after death. Ancient Egypt, where even after death a criminal's actions were judged and punished by the gods. The ancient Egyptians believed that in the afterlife a person's heart would be weighed against the feather of truth, and if their heart was heavy with guilt, it would be fed to a fearsome creature known as Ammit, the devourer of souls. Can you imagine the terror that this would instill in the hearts of criminals? The ancient Egyptian gods were the ultimate authority when it came to punishing crime. Maes, a lion-headed god, was in charge of dealing out justice to those who disrupted the natural and divine order of life. Criminals who committed heinous acts would be exposed and punished by Maes, who could reveal their guilt and errors to society. Meanwhile, the goddess Meret Sega was known for punishing wicked individuals by inflicting them with blindness or venomous snake bites. She was believed to protect communities from the crimes of wrongdoers, ensuring that justice was served to those who deserved it. It's clear that the ancient Egyptians took crime and punishment seriously, both in this life and the next. The fear of divine retribution may have served as a deterrent for would-be criminals, while the gods themselves were seen as the ultimate arbiters of justice. Number 1. Degradation. Back in the day, losing your property, your job, or your social status was way more than just a setback. It was a form of punishment that struck at the very core of a person's sense of self. The ancient Egyptians knew this all too well, and their justice system reflected it. While they didn't have a specific punishment for degradation, many of their other forms of punishment included some pretty humiliating experiences. From being paraded around town in shackles to being forced to do menial labor, there was no shortage of ways to strip a person of their dignity. But wait, there's more. In one extreme case, a criminal was actually stripped of their name. Yep, you heard that right. In ancient Egypt, your name was considered a secret and powerful thing. So when someone was deemed unworthy of their name, it was a big deal. And let's not forget about the property. Losing your stuff was a common punishment, but the exact method varied. Sometimes it was just straight-up confiscation, other times it was the removal from office, and still other times it was, well, who knows? The point is, the ancient Egyptians had a lot of ways to make you pay for your crimes, and none of them were pleasant. Thanks for joining us in this journey through some of the most insane punishments used during ancient Egypt. We hope you found this as fascinating and mind-boggling as we did. See you in the next video.